I never thought I'd be telling this story, but here I am. My name's Helen, and up until a few months ago, I thought I had it all figured out. A nice house in the suburbs of Boston, a decent job at a local publishing company, and a husband I thought I knew inside and out. Funny how life can flip on you faster than a New England weather forecast. It all started with Aunt Martha's passing. She was this larger-than-life figure in our family, always smelling of lavender and telling stories about her globetrotting days. When she left me her house and a chunk of change in her will, I was floored. It was like she knew I needed an escape hatch before I even realized I was trapped. Daniel, my husband of 8 years, seemed happy enough about the inheritance at first. We moved into Aunt Martha's Victorian-style home, with its creaky floorboards and garden that always seemed to bloom no matter the season. But as the weeks turned into months, I started noticing changes in him. Little things at first, a snide comment here, a controlling gesture there. It was like watching a familiar face slowly morph into a stranger's. One crisp fall evening, as the leaves outside our window were turning golden, everything came to a head. I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for a stew, when Daniel burst in, waving his phone like it was a war flag. "Helen, we need to talk," he said, his voice tight with that tone I'd come to dread. "It's about Clara." Clara was Daniel's sister, a whirlwind of drama and bad decisions. She'd recently divorced her third husband and was, apparently, in dire straits. Again. "What about her?" I asked, not looking up from the carrots I was dicing. "She needs help, Helen. Financial help." Daniel's words hung in the air like smoke. "I think we should give her some of the money Aunt Martha left you." I put down the knife and turned to face him. "Daniel, we've been through this. That money is for our future, for the plans we made." "Plans change," he snapped. "Clara's family. She needs us." The argument that followed was like a well-rehearsed dance, each of us knowing our steps but hoping for a different outcome. We'd had variations of this conversation before, but this time felt different. There was an edge to Daniel's voice, a desperation I hadn't heard before. "It's not just about the money," I tried to explain. "Clara's never been responsible. Remember when she borrowed my car and totaled it? Or when she borrowed your credit card for a spa weekend?" Daniel's face clouded over. "That's in the past. She's changed." "Has she?" I countered. "Or is this just another bailout that'll enable her?" That's when it happened. One moment, Daniel was standing across the kitchen island, the next, his hand was connecting with my cheek. The slap echoed in the suddenly silent room, and I stumbled back, more from shock than the force of the blow. "You ungrateful witch!" Daniel roared, his face contorted with a rage I'd never seen before. "This house, that money, it should all be ours, not just yours. You think you're so much better than everyone else, don't you?" I stood there, my hand on my stinging cheek, staring at this man I thought I knew. In that moment, it was like a veil had been lifted. All the little moments of control, the subtle put-downs, the way he'd been slowly isolating me from my friends and family, it all came into sharp focus. Without a word, I walked past him, grabbed my coat from the hook by the door, and left. I didn't have a plan, I just knew I couldn't stay in that house a second longer. The streets of our little suburb were quiet as I walked, leaves crunching under my feet. My mind was racing, trying to piece together how I'd ended up here. Had I been blind, or just willfully ignorant? The chill in the air matched the cold realization settling in my gut. My marriage, my life as I knew it, was over. I ended up at a little 24-hour diner on the edge of town. Sally's, it was called. I'd driven past it 100 times but never stopped in. Now, sitting in a worn vinyl booth, nursing a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been on the burner since the Reagan administration, I tried to figure out my next move. "You okay, hun?" The waitress, a woman with kind eyes and grey hair peeking out from under her cap, asked as she refilled my cup. I must have looked a sight, still in my house clothes, probably with a red mark on my cheek. I don't know," I admitted. She nodded, like she'd heard it all before. "Well, you take your time. Coffee's on the house." As the night wore on, other patrons came and went. A group of college kids, laughing and full of life. An old man who looked like he came here every night, reading a dog-eared paperback. A couple of cops on their break, nodding at me as they took their usual booth. I felt like I was watching life go on around me while I was stuck in pause. By the time the sun started peeking over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, I had the beginnings of a plan. I couldn't go back, that much I knew. But I also wasn't going to let Daniel push me out of my own life. I called in sick to work, then made another call, to Martin, the family lawyer who'd handled Aunt Martha's estate. If anyone could help me navigate this mess, it would be him. Helen. Martin's voice was groggy when he picked up. Is everything all right? Not really, Martin, I said, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. I need your help. Can we meet? An hour later, I was sitting in Martin's office, pouring out the whole story. To his credit, he listened without judgment, only interrupting to ask clarifying questions. Well, he said when I finished, leaning back in his chair, the good news is, your aunt's will was airtight. The house and the money are yours, free and clear. Daniel has no claim on them. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. So what do I do now? Martin's expression turned serious. Helen, what Daniel did, that's assault. You have options. We can file for a restraining order, start divorce proceedings. But first things first, we need to make sure you're safe. The rest of the day was a blur of paperwork and phone calls. Martin helped me set up a temporary place to stay, a small apartment owned by a client of his who was out of the country. By nightfall, I was sitting on a borrowed couch, surrounded by walls that weren't mine, trying to process everything that had happened. As I sat there, staring out the window at a city that suddenly felt both familiar and foreign, I realized something. This wasn't just about leaving Daniel. It was about reclaiming my life, my independence. For too long, I'd let myself be defined by my relationship, by what others expected of me. Now, faced with the ruins of what I thought was a happy marriage, I had a chance to rebuild, not just my life, but myself. I thought about Aunt Martha, about the stories she used to tell of her adventures around the world. She'd lived life on her own terms, never letting anyone dictate her path. Maybe this was her final gift to me, not just the house and the money, but the push I needed to find my own way. As I drifted off to sleep that night, on a bed that wasn't mine in a room I didn't know, I made a promise to myself. This wouldn't break me. Whatever came next, whatever Daniel tried to throw my way, I'd face it head on. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just Daniel's wife or Aunt Martha's niece, I was Helen, and I was ready to find out exactly what that meant. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Martin, bless him, worked tirelessly to get everything in order. We filed for a temporary restraining order against Daniel, citing the assault. The police took my statement, their faces grim as I recounted that night in the kitchen. It felt surreal, like I was talking about someone else's life. All the while, my phone buzzed constantly with messages from Daniel. Apologies, threats, promises to change. It was like watching all the stages of grief play out in my message inbox. I didn't respond to any of them. Each message just reinforced that I'd made the right decision. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the loneliness felt overwhelming, when the habit of 8 years made me reach for the phone to call him. But each time, I'd remember the look in his eyes that night, the feeling of his hand connecting with my face, and I'd put the phone down. Instead, I threw myself into rebuilding. I went back to work, grateful for the routine and the sympathetic ears of co-workers who knew something was up but didn't pry. I started reconnecting with old friends, realizing how much I'd let those relationships slide over the years. And through it all, I waited. Because I knew Daniel, and I knew this calm wouldn't last. He'd always been the type to think he could talk his way out of anything. It was only a matter of time before he made his move. I just hadn't expected it to be so public. It was a crisp Saturday morning when Daniel made his move. I was at the farmer's market downtown, trying to reclaim some normalcy in my life, when I saw him. He was standing by the apple stand, chatting with Mrs. Johnson, our next-door neighbor. My stomach dropped as I watched him laugh and smile, playing the part of the charming neighbor we all knew so well. I ducked behind a display of pumpkins, my heart racing. This was my neighborhood, my routine, and here he was, acting like nothing had changed. I watched as he worked his way through the market, stopping to talk with friends and acquaintances. It was like watching a masterclass in manipulation. By the time I made it home, my phone was buzzing with messages. Saw Daniel at the market. Everything okay? Helen, dear, is it true what Daniel's saying? It seemed like he'd told anyone who would listen that we were just going through a rough patch, that I was struggling with some issues, but that he was standing by me. I sat on my borrowed couch, surrounded by boxes I still hadn't unpacked, and felt the anger rise. This was classic Daniel, rewriting the narrative, making himself the hero of the story. And the worst part, people were buying it. That's when I knew I couldn't just hide away and hope this would all blow over. If Daniel was going to play this game, I needed to be ready. I called Martin. Helen, he said when he picked up, I was just about to call you. Have you seen the Daniel show at the farmer's market? Yeah, I had front row seats, I cut in. Martin sighed. We need to talk strategy. Can you come to the office? An hour later, I was sitting across from Martin in his downtown office. The view of the Boston skyline usually calmed me, but today it just reminded me of how small I felt in the face of what I was up against. All right, Martin said, leaning forward. Here's where we stand. The restraining order is in place, but Daniel hasn't violated it technically. He's staying away from you and the house. But this public relations campaign he's running, it's not illegal, but it's not good for us either. I nodded, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on me. So what do we do? Martin's eyes gleamed with a determination I hadn't seen before. We fight fire with fire, Helen. But we do it smart. We do it legal. Over the next few hours, we hatched a plan. It wasn't flashy or dramatic, but it was solid. We'd document everything, every message, every chance encounter Daniel orchestrated, every rumor that made its way back to us. We'd build a case showing his pattern of manipulation and control. But more than that, we decided it was time for me to reclaim my narrative. You can't hide forever, Helen, Martin said gently. The longer you stay in the shadows, the more Daniel controls the story. He was right, of course. But the thought of facing everyone, of having to explain and defend myself, made me feel sick. That night, as I tossed and turned in my temporary bed, I thought about Aunt Martha again. I remembered a story she told me once, about a time she got stranded in a small village in Peru during a political uprising. The trick, she'd said, her eyes twinkling with the memory, is to act like you belong, even when you feel like a stranger in your own skin. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. I started small, a coffee date with my old friend Sarah, who I'd been dodging calls from for weeks. We met at a little cafe near the Commons, neutral ground. Helen, Sarah said as soon as she saw me, pulling me into a hug. God, I've been so worried. We settled into a quiet corner, and I took a deep breath. Sarah, I need to tell you something, and I need you to really hear me. For the next hour, I laid it all out. The slow erosion of my independence, the financial control, the isolation from friends and family. And finally, that night in the kitchen. Sarah listened, her face a mix of shock and growing anger. That bastard, she whispered when I finished. Helen, why didn't you tell me sooner? I shrugged, feeling the weight of years of silence. I guess. I was ashamed. I thought I should be able to handle it, to fix it. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You have nothing to be ashamed of. And you're not alone, not anymore. That conversation with Sarah was like breaking a dam. Over the next few weeks, I had similar talks with other friends, with co-workers, even with Mrs. Johnson from next door. Each time, I felt a little stronger, a little more like myself. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were still plenty of people who bought into Daniel's version of events. I'd walk into the grocery store and conversations would stop, replaced by pointed looks and whispers. My inbox was a minefield of well-meaning but misguided advice, people urging me to work things out with Daniel. Through it all, I kept my head high. I went to work, I volunteered at the local animal shelter, I lived my life. And slowly, I started to see a shift. People who had been avoiding me started to meet my eyes again. Conversations that had died when I entered a room began to include me. It wasn't until the annual neighborhood block party that I realized how much things had changed. I almost didn't go, the thought of facing everyone at once was daunting. But Sarah insisted, offering to be my buffer. As we walked down the street, I braced myself for awkward silences and pitying looks. Instead, I was met with genuine smiles and warm greetings. Mrs. Peterson, who I was sure had been firmly in Daniel's camp, pulled me aside. "Helen, dear," she said, her voice low. "I owe you an apology. I should have known better than to believe. Well, you know. My Harold, God rest his soul, he could charm the birds from the trees. But behind closed doors." She trailed off, her eyes distant with old memories. I felt a lump in my throat. "Mrs. Peterson, you don't have to dash," she patted my hand. "I do, dear. And I want you to know, we're here for you. Whatever you need." As the sun set over our little slice of suburban Boston, I found myself surrounded by neighbors and friends, laughing and talking like I hadn't in years. For the first time since that night in the kitchen, I felt like I could breathe fully. But even as I basked in this newfound support, a part of me remained vigilant. I knew Daniel too well to think he'd give up easily. This peace, this calm, it felt like the stillness before a storm. My instincts proved right sooner than I expected. It was a Tuesday evening, and I was just getting home from work when I saw it, a moving truck, parked in front of my house. My heart raced as I pulled into the driveway. What was Daniel up to now? I'd been so careful to keep my distance, to not give him any ammunition. Had he found a loophole in the restraining order? As I got out of my car, the front door opened. But it wasn't Daniel who came out. It was Clara, his sister, her arms full of what looked like my books. "What do you think you're doing?" I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. Clara jumped, nearly dropping the books. "Helen, Daniel said. He told me you'd agreed to let us use the house while you were away." I felt a cold fury settle over me. So this was his play, moving his sister into my house, trying to establish some kind of claim. "Put those back, Clara. Now." She hesitated, looking between me and the house. But Daniel said Daniel lied. I cut her off. "This is my house. You need to leave. Now." I could see the moment reality set in for her. Clara's face crumpled, and for a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. As Clara retreated into the house, presumably to gather her things, I pulled out my phone and called Martin. "We've got a situation," I said as soon as he picked up. While I waited for Martin to arrive, I stood guard in the driveway, watching as Clara and a couple of friends I didn't recognize carried boxes and furniture back out to the truck. They avoided my eyes, working in a tense silence broken only by the occasional muffled argument from inside the house. By the time Martin's car pulled up, the moving truck was pulling away, Clara in the passenger seat, her face streaked with angry tears. Martin surveyed the scene, his expression grim. "Well," he said, "it looks like Daniel's made his move. You ready for this, Helen?" I took a deep breath, looking at the house that had been the center of so much joy and pain. "Yeah," I said, surprised to find I meant it. "I'm ready." As we walked up to the front door, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Fear, anger, but also a growing determination. Daniel had shown his hand, and in doing so, he'd given us exactly what we needed. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about standing up to a bully, about showing others that it was possible to break free. I put my key in the lock, the familiar click as it turned, feeling like the starting gun of a race I hadn't known I was running. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to let Daniel win. Not this time. Not ever again. The next few weeks were like living in a pressure cooker. Every day brought a new challenge, a new tactic from Daniel's playbook. It was exhausting, but I was determined not to let him wear me down. The day after the moving truck incident, I woke up to find my inbox flooded with emails from our mutual friends and acquaintances. Apparently, Daniel had spent the night reaching out to everyone we knew, spinning a tale of how I'd cruelly kicked his poor sister out onto the street. He painted himself as the caring brother, just trying to help family in need, and me as the heartless witch standing in his way. I sat at my kitchen table, scrolling through message after message of confused and concerned friends, feeling a mix of anger and, oddly enough, amusement. Did Daniel really think this would work? That people would just forget everything that had happened and side with him because of one dramatic gesture. But as the day wore on, and more messages poured in, I realized that for some people, it was working. There were those who bought into Daniel's story hook, line, and sinker. They saw him as the wronged party, the victim of my mental breakdown or midlife crisis or whatever other excuse he was peddling. It was Clara who really threw me for a loop, though. She showed up at my office 2 days later, all teary-eyed and apologetic. "Helen, I'm so sorry," she sniffled, perching on the edge of the chair across from my desk. "I had no idea. Daniel told me you two had agreed to let me stay at the house while you were getting help." I raised an eyebrow. "Getting help?" Clara nodded, her eyes wide. "For your issues. Daniel said you were struggling with some mental health problems, that you'd agreed to seek treatment and let us use the house in the meantime." I felt a surge of anger, not just at Daniel, but at Clara too. How could she be so naive? But looking at her, I saw something else, a desperation that I recognized all too well. Clara had always been easy prey for Daniel's manipulations, always eager for his approval. I took a deep breath. "Clara, listen to me carefully. Daniel and I are separated. There's a restraining order against him. He has no right to offer anyone use of my house, and I'm not seeking any kind of treatment." "He lied to you." I watched the realization dawn on her face, followed quickly by confusion and then embarrassment. But why would he?" "Because that's what Daniel does," I said, feeling suddenly very tired. "He manipulates situations to get what he wants, and he doesn't care who he hurts in the process." Clara left my office in tears, apologizing profusely. I felt bad for her, in a way. She was just another victim of Daniel's games. But I also knew I couldn't trust her. She'd always choose her brother's side in the end. That evening, I met with Martin to discuss our next steps. We were sitting in a quiet corner of a local pub, the kind of place where the wood is dark with age and the bartender knows everyone's name. "He's getting desperate," Martin said, taking a sip of his beer. "This move with Clara, the emails to your friends, he's throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks." I nodded, picking at the label on my bottle of hard cider. "But it is sticking, with some people at least. I've had friends, people I've known for years, tell me they think I'm being unreasonable, that I should give Daniel another chance." Martin leaned forward, his eyes intense. "That's exactly what he wants. He's trying to isolate you, to make you doubt yourself. But we've got something he doesn't expect." I raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Martin grinned, a fierce expression that made me glad he was on my side. "The truth, Helen. And a paper trail a mile long." Over the next hour, Martin laid out his plan. We'd been quietly gathering evidence, emails, text messages, financial records showing Daniel's attempts to control our money. We had statements from neighbors who'd overheard arguments, from friends who'd witnessed Daniel's controlling behavior over the years. "It's time to stop playing defense," Martin said. "We're going to file for divorce, and we're going to do it in a way that leaves no doubt about who Daniel really is." I felt a mix of fear and exhilaration. This was it, the point of no return. But I knew it was the right move. Daniel had shown his true colors, and I was done letting him control the narrative. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. I took a week off work, using vacation days I'd been saving for a trip Daniel and I had planned to the Bahamas. Instead of sipping cocktails on a beach, I spent my days in Martin's office, going over documents and preparing my statement. It was harder than I expected, laying out the history of our relationship in cold, legal terms. Every controlling comment, every manipulative action, every time he'd made me feel small or worthless, it all had to be documented. There were moments when I had to stop, overwhelmed by the memories. But there were bright spots too. Sarah came by every evening, armed with takeout and a shoulder to cry on if I needed it. My boss, when I explained the situation, was incredibly supportive, assuring me that my job was secure and offering the company's legal team if I needed extra help. And through it all, Daniel kept digging himself deeper. He seemed to think that if he just pushed hard enough, made enough noise, I'd give in. He showed up at my favorite coffee shop, at the grocery store, always with a sad smile and a plea to talk things out. Each time, I documented the encounter and reported it to the police. It all came to a head on a sunny Thursday afternoon. I was leaving work when I saw him, leaning against my car in the parking lot. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. I'd prepared for this. "Daniel," I said, keeping my voice level. "You need to leave. Now." He held up his hands, all innocence. "Helen, please. I just want to talk. We can work this out, I know we can." I stood my ground, phone in hand, 911 already dialed and ready to call. "This is a violation of the restraining order, Daniel. Leave now, or I'm calling the police." For a moment, I saw a flash of the old Daniel, the anger, the need for control. But then it was gone, replaced by a look of sad resignation that I might have believed, once. "You're making a mistake, Helen," he said as he backed away. "You need me. You'll see that soon enough." I watched him go, my heart pounding. As soon as he was out of sight, I called Martin. "It happened," I said when he picked up. "Just like you said it would." Martin's voice was grim but satisfied. "Good. This is exactly what we needed. Come to the office first thing tomorrow. It's time to file." As I drove home that evening, I felt a strange sense of calm. Daniel thought he was winning, that his pressure and manipulations were wearing me down. He had no idea what was coming. I thought about the Helen I'd been when this all started, scared, unsure, ready to doubt myself at every turn. That Helen was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who wasn't afraid to fight back. Daniel's false victory was about to crumble, and I was ready to watch it fall. The morning after Daniel's parking lot ambush, I woke up before my alarm, a mixture of dread and determination swirling in my stomach. Today was the day we'd file for divorce. It felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. I got ready in a daze, barely tasting the coffee I gulped down. As I was about to leave, I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror. The woman staring back at me looked tired, yes, but there was a strength in her eyes that I hadn't seen in years. I straightened my shoulders and headed out the door. Martin's office was already buzzing with activity when I arrived. His assistant, a no-nonsense woman named Jeanette, ushered me into a conference room where Martin was waiting with a stack of papers that seemed a mile high. "Morning, Helen," he said, looking up from the documents. "Ready to make history?" I couldn't help but smile at his enthusiasm. "As ready as I'll ever be, I suppose." We spent the next few hours going over every detail of the divorce filing. It wasn't just about ending the marriage, it was about telling the truth of what had happened, of who Daniel really was. We included everything, the financial records showing his attempts to control our money, the documented incidents of emotional abuse, statements from friends and neighbors who had witnessed his behavior over the years. "Now, Helen," Martin said, his tone serious, "once we file this, there's no going back. Daniel's going to come at us with everything he's got. Are you absolutely sure you're ready for this?" I took a deep breath, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The years of subtle put-downs, the isolation from friends and family, the constant feeling of walking on eggshells. And then that final, unforgivable moment when he'd raised his hand to me. "I'm sure," I said, my voice steady. "Let's do this." Martin nodded, a look of pride in his eyes. "All right then. Let's go change your life." The actual filing was anticlimactic. A visit to the courthouse, a stack of papers handed over to a bored-looking clerk, and it was done. I stood on the courthouse steps afterward, feeling like I should feel something. Sadness, maybe, or regret. But all I felt was a profound sense of relief. That relief was short-lived. By the time I got back to my apartment, my phone was blowing up with messages. Word had spread fast, and it seemed like everyone had an opinion. There were supportive messages from Sarah and a few other close friends who knew the whole story. But there were also confused and angry messages from mutual friends who'd bought into Daniel's version of events. And then there was Daniel himself, his messages swinging wildly between pleading and threatening. I turned my phone off and spent the evening in blessed silence, knowing that the real storm was yet to come. The next few weeks were a blur of legal meetings, depositions, and carefully orchestrated public appearances. Martin had been right, Daniel came at us with everything he had. He hired a high-profile divorce attorney known for his aggressive tactics. Suddenly, I was being painted as unstable, greedy, even potentially violent. But we were ready for him. For every accusation Daniel's team threw at us, we had documentation to refute it. Financial records that showed it was Daniel, not me, who had been reckless with our money. Emails and text messages that revealed his controlling behavior. And, of course, the police report from the night he'd hit me. It was exhausting, having to relive every painful moment of our marriage. But with each piece of evidence we presented, I could see Daniel's facade crumbling. The charming, successful businessman image he'd cultivated for so long was being stripped away, revealing the insecure, controlling man beneath. Through it all, I kept my head high. I went to work, I volunteered at the animal shelter, I had dinner with friends. I lived my life, refusing to let Daniel see how much this was affecting me. One particularly tough day, after a grueling deposition where Daniel's lawyer had tried to twist every word I said, I found myself at the old diner where I'd ended up the night I left Daniel. Sally, the kind-eyed waitress, was still there. She took one look at me and brought over a cup of coffee without me having to ask. "Rough day, hun?" she asked, sliding into the booth across from me. I nodded, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "You could say that." Sally patted my hand. "You know, I've seen a lot of folks come through here over the years. Seen a lot of people at their lowest. But I gotta say, you're something special." I looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" She smiled. "Most folks, when they're going through something like what you're going through, they let it consume them. But you're fighting back. And not just for yourself, from what I hear." I'd almost forgotten that Sally's niece volunteered at the same animal shelter I did. Word got around in a small town. "I'm just trying to do the right thing," I said. Sally shook her head. "You're doing more than that. You're showing others that it's possible to stand up, to break free. That matters, honey. It matters a lot." Her words stayed with me long after I left the diner. She was right, this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every person who'd ever felt trapped, who'd ever doubted their own worth because someone else told them they were worthless. The next day, I did something I'd been considering for a while. I reached out to a local women's shelter and offered to share my story. The director, a woman named Mara with kind eyes and a fierce demeanor, was thrilled. "You have no idea how much this will mean to our residents," she said when we met to discuss the details. "To see someone who's been through it, who's come out the other side, it gives them hope." And so, in between legal meetings and work and trying to maintain some semblance of a normal life, I started speaking at the shelter. At first, it was terrifying. Standing in front of a room full of women who had been through horrors I could scarcely imagine, I felt like a fraud. What could I possibly say to them? But as I shared my story, the slow erosion of my self-esteem, the isolation, the fear, I saw recognition in their eyes. And when I talked about finding the strength to leave, about rebuilding my life, I saw something else: hope. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of it all felt like too much to bear. Days when I wanted nothing more than to curl up in bed and hide from the world. But every time I felt like giving up, I thought of those women at the shelter. Of Sally at the diner. Of every person who was watching my story unfold, wondering if they too could find the strength to change their lives. And so I kept going. I showed up to every meeting, every deposition, every court date. I stood tall in the face of Daniel's accusations and manipulations. And slowly, surely, the tide began to turn. It happened gradually at first. A few of our mutual friends reached out, apologizing for believing Daniel's lies. Then local media started picking up on the story, not as a salacious divorce tale, but as an example of standing up to abuse. Daniel, meanwhile, was unraveling. His carefully crafted image was in tatters, and he was lashing out in increasingly desperate ways. He tried to paint me as the abuser, claiming I'd been emotionally manipulative. When that didn't work, he accused me of infidelity. Each wild claim was met with calm refutation from our legal team. Through it all, I maintained my silence in public. No angry social media posts, no retaliatory accusations. I let the evidence speak for itself. And speak it did. As we neared the final stages of the divorce proceedings, I felt a shift. The fear and uncertainty that had plagued me for so long were fading, replaced by a quiet confidence. Whatever the outcome, I knew I had done the right thing. I had reclaimed my voice, my power, my life. Daniel's false victory was crumbling, and from its ruins, I was building something new. Something stronger. Something that was entirely my own. The day of the final hearing arrived with a mix of trepidation and relief. As I stood in front of my mirror, adjusting my blazer, I caught sight of the calendar on my bedroom wall. It had been exactly 1 year since that fateful night in the kitchen. 1 year since Daniel had shown his true colors. 1 year since I'd found the strength to walk away. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Today was the day it would all end, one way or another. The courthouse was buzzing with activity when I arrived. News of our case had spread, and there was a small crowd of reporters gathered on the steps. I kept my head down, grateful for Martin's steady presence beside me as we made our way inside. "You ready for this?" Martin asked as we waited outside the courtroom. I nodded, surprised to find that I meant it. "I'm ready for it to be over." As we entered the courtroom, I saw Daniel for the first time in months. He was sitting at the table with his lawyer, looking pale and drawn. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I was struck by the desperation I saw there. This was a man who knew he was losing everything. The judge, a stern-looking woman with graying hair, called the court to order. What followed was a blur of legal jargon and final arguments. Daniel's lawyer tried one last time to paint me as the villain, spinning tales of my supposed instability and greed. But when it was our turn, Martin was magnificent. He laid out our case methodically, presenting evidence of Daniel's financial manipulations, his controlling behavior, the incident of physical abuse. With each piece of evidence, I could see the judge's expression hardening. Finally, it was my turn to speak. As I took the stand, I felt a calm settle over me. This was my moment to tell my truth, not just to the court, but to myself. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady, "I stand before you today not just as a woman seeking a divorce, but as someone who is reclaiming her life. 4 years, I lived in fear of disappointing my husband, fear of his anger, fear of being alone. I allowed myself to be isolated from friends and family, to doubt my own worth and capabilities." I paused, glancing at Daniel. He wouldn't meet my eyes. The night Daniel hit me was a turning point. It was the moment when I realized that staying in this marriage wasn't just hurting me, it was destroying me. Walking away was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also the most necessary. I went on to detail the events of the past year, the manipulations, the public smear campaign, the constant violations of the restraining order. But I also talked about the strength I'd found, the support I'd received from unexpected places, and the women I'd met at the shelter who'd shown me the true meaning of resilience. "Your Honor," I concluded, "I'm not here seeking revenge. I'm here seeking justice, not just for myself, but for every person who has ever felt trapped in an abusive relationship. I'm here to say that it's possible to break free, to rebuild, to thrive. That's all I'm asking for today, the chance to move forward with my life, free from fear and control." As I stepped down from the stand, I caught sight of Sarah in the gallery, tears streaming down her face. She gave me a small nod, and I felt a surge of gratitude for her unwavering support. The judge called a recess to consider her decision. Those were the longest 2 hours of my life. I sat in a small conference room with Martin, picking at a sandwich I couldn't taste, trying not to let my mind race with all the possible outcomes. When we were called back into the courtroom, my heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. The judge looked at each of us in turn before speaking. "In the matter of Helen versus Daniel," she began, her voice firm, "I have considered all the evidence presented, as well as the testimonies given. It is clear to this court that Mr. Daniel has engaged in a pattern of emotional and financial abuse, culminating in an act of physical violence. Furthermore, his actions since the separation, the repeated violations of the restraining order, the attempts to manipulate public opinion, the financial maneuverings show a disturbing lack of respect for both this court and for Ms. Helen." She paused, and I held my breath. "Therefore, it is the decision of this court to grant the divorce on the grounds of cruel and abusive treatment. All assets acquired during the marriage will be divided equally, with the exception of the house and inheritance left to Ms. Helen by her aunt, which will remain solely in her possession. Furthermore, the restraining order against Mr. Daniel will be extended indefinitely. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It was over. We'd won. But the judge wasn't finished. "Mr. Daniel," she said, her tone sharp, "this court takes a very dim view of your actions. You will undergo mandatory counseling, and any further attempts to contact or harass Ms. Helen will result in severe legal consequences. Do I make myself clear?" Daniel nodded, his face ashen. For the first time, he looked truly defeated. As we left the courtroom, I felt lighter than I had in years. The crowd of reporters was still there, shouting questions, but Martin deftly guided me past them to a side exit. Once we were safely in his car, Martin turned to me with a grin. "Congratulations, Helen. You did it." I leaned back in my seat, letting out a long breath. "We did it," I corrected him. "I couldn't have done this without you, Martin." He shook his head. "Don't sell yourself short. You're the one who had the courage to stand up and fight. I just provided the legal backup." We drove in comfortable silence for a while before Martin spoke again. "So, what's next for you?" It was a question I'd been asking myself a lot lately. With the divorce finalized, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a new chapter in my life. The possibilities were both exciting and terrifying. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "But for the first time in a long time, I feel like I have options. Real options." Martin nodded approvingly. "Well, whatever you decide, I have a feeling you're going to do great things, Helen." That evening, I found myself back at Sally's diner. It felt fitting to end this chapter where it had begun. Sally spotted me as soon as I walked in and hurried over with a steaming cup of coffee. "Well?" she asked, her eyes twinkling. I couldn't help but smile. "It's over. The divorce is final." Sally let out a whoop that turned heads throughout the diner. "That calls for celebration. Pie's on the house tonight, honey." As I sat there, savoring a slice of Sally's famous apple pie, I thought about everything that had led me to this moment. The pain, the fear, the doubt, but also the strength I'd found, the friendships I'd rekindled and the new ones I'd made. I thought about the women at the shelter, about how sharing my story had given them hope. I thought about Sarah, who had stood by me through it all. About Martin, who had fought so hard for justice. About Sally, whose simple kindness had been a lifeline on my darkest days. And I thought about Daniel. Despite everything, I didn't hate him. I pitied him, in a way. He was a man so consumed by his need for control that he'd lost everything that truly mattered. As for me, I was just beginning. The future stretched out before me, full of possibilities. For the first time in years, I was free to chase my dreams, to rediscover who I was outside of being Daniel's wife. It wouldn't be easy, I knew that. There would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt and fear. But I also knew that I was strong enough to face whatever came my way. As I finished my pie, I made a silent promise to myself. To live boldly, to love fiercely, and to never again let anyone dim my light. The moment of truth had come and gone, and I had emerged victorious. This wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning. My beginning. And I couldn't wait to see what came next. The weeks following the divorce felt like waking up from a long, troubled sleep. I found myself noticing things I'd overlooked for years, the way the morning light filtered through the curtains, the comforting buzz of my favorite coffee shop, the simple joy of making plans without having to consult anyone else. It wasn't all smooth sailing, of course. There were nights when the silence in my apartment felt oppressive, when the magnitude of the changes in my life threatened to overwhelm me. But for every moment of doubt, there was a counterbalancing moment of pure, unadulterated freedom. One sunny Saturday morning, about a month after the final hearing, I woke up with an inexplicable urge to redecorate. I'd been living in the same apartment since I left Daniel, surrounded by a mishmash of hastily purchased furniture and a few treasured pieces I'd managed to take from our old house. It was time for a change. I called Sarah, and within an hour, we were prowling through thrift stores and flea markets. It was the most fun I'd had in years, laughing with my best friend as we debated the merits of various ugly lamps and tried on ridiculous hats. You know, Sarah said as we were lugging a vintage dresser up the stairs to my apartment, I don't think I've seen you smile this much since college. I paused, realizing she was right. I guess I have a lot to smile about these days. As we arranged my new old furniture and hung artwork on the walls, I felt a sense of reclamation. This space was mine, every inch of it a reflection of my tastes, my choices. No more walking on eggshells, no more compromising my style to avoid an argument. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it felt monumental. The changes weren't just in my living space. I started taking risks at work, pitching ideas for projects I would have been too insecure to suggest before. To my surprise, my boss was enthusiastic, and soon I found myself leading a team on a new community outreach initiative. It was challenging, pushing me out of my comfort zone in ways I hadn't experienced in years. There were late nights and stressful meetings, moments when I doubted my abilities. But there were triumphs too, the first time I successfully presented to the board, the day we secured a major grant for our project. With each small victory, I felt myself growing stronger, more confident. My work with the women's shelter continued as well. What had started as occasional speaking engagements evolved into a regular volunteer position. I worked with the shelter's staff to develop a program helping women rebuild their lives after leaving abusive situations, everything from financial literacy classes to job interview workshops. It was during one of these workshops that I met Lydia. She was quiet at first, hesitant to participate. But as the weeks went by, I saw her start to come out of her shell. One day, after class, she approached me. I just wanted to say thank you, she said, her voice soft but steady. When I first came here, I couldn't imagine ever feeling normal again. But listening to your story, seeing how you've rebuilt your life, it gives me hope. I felt a lump in my throat. You're stronger than you know, Lydia. You've already taken the hardest step by leaving. The rest. You've got this. As I watched Lydia walk away, head held high, I thought about how far I'd come. A year ago, I'd been the one needing reassurance, clinging to every word of encouragement like a lifeline. Now, I was the one offering hope to others. It was a responsibility I took seriously, a reminder of why I'd fought so hard to reclaim my life. Of course, it wasn't all work and volunteering. I was rediscovering the joy of having a social life that didn't revolve around Daniel's preferences. Sarah and I had standing weekly dinner dates. I joined a book club, relishing the lively debates over plots and characters. I even tried my hand at salsa dancing, laughing at my own clumsiness but enjoying the sheer fun of it. It was at one of these salsa classes that I ran into Tom, a friend from college I hadn't seen in years. We grabbed coffee after class, catching up on the intervening years. Tom had been through his own divorce a few years back, and there was a comfort in talking to someone who understood the unique challenges of rebuilding a life. As weeks turned into months, Tom and I started spending more time together. It was nice, having male companionship that came with no expectations, no pressure. We were just two friends enjoying each other's company, whether we were trying out new restaurants or binge-watching cheesy sci-fi shows. One evening, as we were walking through the park after dinner, Tom turned to me with a serious expression. "Helen," he said, "I hope this isn't overstepping, but I really like you. More than just as a friend. And I was wondering if maybe you'd like to go on a real date sometime." I felt a flutter of panic in my chest. Was I ready for this? The thought of opening myself up to another relationship was terrifying. But as I looked at Tom, kind, patient Tom who had never pushed or pressured me, I realized that the fear wasn't insurmountable. "I'd like that," I heard myself say. "But, can we take it slow? I'm still figuring out who I am on my own." Tom's smile was understanding. "Of course. We've got all the time in the world." As we continued our walk, hand in hand now, I marveled at how different this felt from the beginning of my relationship with Daniel. There was no rush, no pressure to define things or commit. Just two people enjoying each other's company, seeing where life might take us. It wasn't just my personal life that was blossoming. My work on the community outreach project was gaining attention. When a position opened up to head a new department focused on social responsibility initiatives, my boss encouraged me to apply. The old Helen would have demurred, convinced she wasn't qualified. But this new Helen. She threw herself into preparing for the interview, drawing on all the confidence and skills she'd gained over the past year. The day I was offered the job was surreal. As I sat in my boss's office, listening to her outline the responsibilities and opportunities that came with the position, I had a moment of clarity. This was what freedom felt like. The ability to pursue my passions, to challenge myself, to grow not in spite of someone else, but for myself. That evening, I found myself back at Sally's Diner. It had become a touchstone for me, a place to mark the milestones of my journey. "Well, if it isn't my favorite customer," Sally said as I slid into my usual booth. "What's the occasion this time?" I couldn't help but grin. "I got a promotion today. I'm going to be heading up a new department." Sally let out a whoop of joy, drawing smiles from the other patrons. "I always knew you had it in you, honey. This calls for a celebration. Pie and ice cream, on the house." As I savored my celebratory dessert, I thought about the long, winding path that had led me here. The pain, the fear, the moments of doubt, they were all part of my story. But they weren't the whole story. Not anymore. I thought about Daniel, wondering briefly where he was, what he was doing. I hoped, for his sake, that he was getting the help he needed. But his story was no longer entwined with mine. My story was still being written, each day a new page filled with possibilities. I had rediscovered old passions and found new ones. I had strengthened old friendships and forged new connections. I had found a voice I didn't know I had and was using it to help others find theirs. As I finished my pie, I made a silent toast to myself, to the woman I had become. To freedom, to rebirth, to the endless potential of a life lived on my own terms. The future stretched out before me, bright with promise. And I was ready for whatever it might bring.